It began with small things, the kind of details you only notice when you love someone too much to suspect anything bad about them. My daughter-in-law, Emily, was all smiles and warmth when she first entered our lives. My son Daniel adored her. She had that polished charm that disarmed people, the kind that makes you believe she's incapable of malice. I wanted to believe it too, but love makes you blind. Age, on the other hand, sharpens your hearing. You start noticing whispers that don't quite match the laughter. You feel tension in rooms where smiles linger too long. At first, I brushed it off. Every family has friction. Every marriage has its unspoken truths. But something about Emily's affection felt rehearsed, a performance for the right audience. It started with her stories. Little inconsistencies. She claimed her family was well off, yet somehow her parents never appeared, not even in photos. She said she worked from home for a design company, but her schedule shifted with every question, and she was always watching me, watching Daniel, as if calculating how much she could control the narrative. Daniel didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't want to. He was too in love, too lost in the idea of building a life with someone who seemed perfect. And as his mother, I didn't want to interfere. You raise your children to make choices even when they break your heart, but peace is fragile. It only takes one careless moment to expose the truth. One afternoon, while Emily was out and Daniel was at work, I went to drop off a box of family photos she had offered to organize. Her office door was half open, papers scattered across the desk. I didn't mean to pry, but something caught my eye: a stack of envelopes with my son's name on them. All unopened, they were credit card bills, heavy ones. The balances were staggering. But what froze me wasn't the numbers, it was the date. These were charges made before she and Daniel got married. Expensive jewelry, hotel stays, designer clothes. Purchases my son never knew about. And then I saw the name on the receipts, not hers, another man's. I stood there for a long time, the silence pressing against my chest like a weight. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, that it was some misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew I'd seen her type before, the kind who wears charm like a mask, who thrives in the blindness of those who love her. When she returned home later that evening, her perfume lingered in the air, too sweet, too strong. Jasmine and deceit. She smiled as if nothing in the world could touch her, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day had been. I smiled back. Uneventful, I said. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain tapped against the window, steady and cold, like time counting down to something inevitable. I thought of Daniel, of his laughter, his trust, the boy who once told me he'd never let anyone hurt me. And now, I had to decide whether to hurt him with the truth. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with knowing something terrible and not being able to speak it. You carry it like a stone under your ribs, heavy and hidden, but I also knew silence could cost him everything. So I made a decision. The next morning, I'd confront her, not with anger, but with clarity. I wanted to look her in the eye and see if the woman my son loved still had a trace of conscience left in her. As dawn crept across the room, I stood by the window, watching the light crawl across the floor. It felt like standing on the edge of something irreversible, and in that moment, I realized peace had already left this house. Morning came slowly, pale light bleeding through the curtains, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. I moved quietly, making coffee the way I always did. The sound of the machine was comforting, familiar, almost enough to silence the thoughts clawing at my mind. Almost. I heard Emily's footsteps before I saw her. Light, unhurried, the confident rhythm of someone who believed the world bent easily in her favor. She was dressed perfectly, as always: silk blouse, diamond studs, her hair falling in effortless waves. It was strange how beautiful deception could look when you didn't yet know what hid beneath it. She smiled when she saw me. "You're up early," she said, reaching for a cup. "So are you," I replied, stirring my coffee slowly, my voice steady. "Couldn't sleep?" Her eyes flicked up for just a second, brief, cautious, before she smiled again. "No, just have a busy day ahead." I studied her, really studied her. The way she avoided direct eye contact, how her hand trembled ever so slightly as she poured her coffee. Most people wouldn't notice, but I wasn't most people. I'd raised a son. I'd learned to read the small shifts the way guilt tries to hide behind politeness. I waited until she sat down. Then I placed a stack of envelopes on the table between us. Her expression didn't change at first. She looked at them, then at me, then back at the letters, as if trying to decide which version of herself she needed to become to handle this. "I found these in your office," I said softly. "I wasn't looking for trouble, Emily, but I think I found it anyway." For a moment, silence stretched between us, taut and sharp. Then she laughed lightly. "You went through my things?" "I was dropping off photos," I replied. "You offered to organize them." Her jaw tightened. "You had no right." "Neither did you," I said quietly, sliding one of the open envelopes toward her. "To lie to my son, to hide debts, to live a double life." The laughter died. Her face hardened, the mask cracking at the edges. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," I said. "I know those receipts aren't from Daniel. I know the name on them. And I know you've been lying to him since the day you met." Her hands froze over the table, her knuckles white. For the first time, she didn't have a rehearsed smile or a clever excuse. Just silence. "You think he'll believe you?" she said finally, her voice lower now, sharper. "You think your son, the man who worships the ground I walk on, will take your word over mine?" The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Daniel loved her blindly. His loyalty was his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. I took a slow breath. "Maybe not right away," I said. "But truth has a way of surfacing, Emily. It always does." Something dark flickered in her eyes, then a glint of calculation. She leaned back, crossing her arms. "You're making a mistake," she said. "A very big one. I think you've misunderstood everything. And if you bring this up to Daniel, you'll only drive him away." She stood, her tone shifting from defensive to manipulative in an instant. "He's finally happy, you know. He's doing better than he's ever done. Do you really want to ruin that?" It was a clever move. She knew exactly where to strike my guilt, my mother's instinct to protect him at all costs. But I'd seen too much. "If happiness is built on lies," I said quietly, "then it isn't happiness. It's a slow collapse waiting to happen." Her jaw tightened. "You think you can threaten me?" I shook my head. "I don't threaten, Emily. I tell the truth. What you do with it is your choice." She stared at me for a long time, her face unreadable. Then, without another word, she gathered the envelopes, neatly stacked them, and walked away. I thought that was the end of it. That maybe, just maybe, she'd feel cornered enough to stop. I was wrong. That night, I noticed my phone was missing from the kitchen counter. I found it later in the trash bin outside, soaked and dead. The next morning, Daniel was strangely distant. Polite, but distant. And Emily was sweeter than ever, hovering around him, whispering things I couldn't hear. I didn't need to. I knew what she was doing. By the third day, Daniel stopped calling me mom. He said he was tired of the drama, that I'd been acting strange lately. His words were rehearsed, too neat to be his own. I wanted to tell him everything, to shake him awake, but Emily was always there between us, smiling. It was then that I understood the danger. She wasn't just lying. She was dismantling me, quietly, methodically. So I waited. I began to watch instead of speaking. I noted her calls, her disappearances, the sudden luxury purchases Daniel couldn't explain. I learned patience from years of motherhood, and I used it now like a weapon. Weeks passed. My son stopped visiting. Emily had successfully driven a wedge so deep that I became a stranger in my own child's life. But lies rot from within, and hers began to unravel. One evening, while at the grocery store, I saw her not alone but with a man. The same name from the receipts. They weren't cautious. They were laughing, holding hands. For a second, I thought she saw me. Her expression froze, just slightly, before she turned away. That was all I needed. I didn't confront her then. Not yet. I let her think I'd been silenced by her manipulation. But inside, I was calm, focused, because I finally understood something. She feared exposure more than she feared anything else. That night, I went home and began writing a letter to Daniel. I didn't beg him to believe me. I didn't accuse. I simply told him the truth, facts, dates, details. I enclosed the receipts I'd kept hidden, the photo I'd taken at the store, and a note that said, "I love you enough to tell you what you don't want to hear." I mailed it the next morning, and then, for the first time in months, I slept without fear. But I didn't know Emily had been watching. Later that evening, as I walked back into the house after watering the plants, I found her waiting in the living room. Calm, too calm. "You sent him something," she said. Her tone wasn't a question. It was a statement, cold, precise. My heart pounded, but my voice didn't shake. "Yes, I did." Her eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer. "You shouldn't have done that." There was no warmth left in her voice now, no charm, just a sharp, quiet edge of a threat. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. I wasn't just dealing with a liar. I was dealing with someone who didn't like losing control. The air between us thickened, tense and still. She smiled faintly. "You've made things very complicated, Margaret," she said, "for everyone." But I didn't flinch. Truth usually does. We stood there in silence, two women, one built on deception, the other on patience, staring across the distance of what could no longer be undone. And as she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "You'll regret this," she said. Maybe I would. But regret was better than silence, because for the first time, I wasn't afraid of her anymore. The next morning began with a silence that didn't feel like peace. It felt like the breath before an explosion. Daniel hadn't called. I checked my phone every few minutes, even though I told myself not to. Every vibration made my stomach twist. I knew Emily had read my letter by now. The question was, what had she done with it? Around noon, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. My son's car. I froze at the sink, soap still clinging to my hands. When the knock came, it wasn't soft. It was firm, angry. I opened the door to see Daniel standing there, his eyes tired, his jaw tight. Emily stood a few steps behind him, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Mom," he said, his voice clipped. "We need to talk." I nodded, stepping aside. My heart ached just looking at him, the little boy who once ran to me when he scraped his knee, now looking at me like a stranger. He sat at the table, tossing my letter onto it. "You sent me this?" "Yes." "Why?" His tone wasn't curious. It was defensive, rehearsed. "Because you deserve to know the truth." Emily let out a soft cough, sitting across from me. "Truth?" "Margaret, you've been confused lately. You've always been protective of Daniel. But this," she gestured toward the papers, "this is delusional." I didn't answer her. I looked at my son instead. "Did you read what I wrote?" He exhaled sharply. "I did. And I also spoke to Emily. She told me everything." "Everything?" I asked quietly. "Including the man she was with last week?" For a moment, his expression faltered. Just a flicker, enough for me to know he hadn't heard that part. Emily's voice was smooth, quick. "Oh, you mean my co-worker?" "We ran into each other after a meeting, Margaret. Please, stop twisting things." I leaned forward. "Do co-workers usually hold hands in the parking lot?" That broke the calm. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. You're accusing my wife of things you can't prove." The word wife hit me like a blade. They'd married quietly months ago. I hadn't even been told. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. I looked at him, steady. "Daniel, you're my son. I raised you to see people for who they are, not who they pretend to be." "She's hiding something. And deep down, you know it." He shook his head, standing up. "What I know is that you've crossed the line. You're trying to ruin my marriage because you can't let me go." My throat tightened. "I'm trying to save you." Emily reached for his arm, her voice soft, dripping with control. "Let's go, love. She needs time." "We all do." He hesitated, torn, then followed her out. The door shut behind them, and for the first time in years, my house felt empty. I stood there for a long time, staring at the letter he'd left on the table, my words now useless ink. Every sound in the house seemed louder, the ticking clock, the wind outside, my own heartbeat. Days passed. No calls, no messages. My son vanished into the life she'd built for him. I told myself to be patient, that truth would surface, but it didn't make the silence easier, until one evening, the phone rang. Unknown number, I answered. Mrs. Lawson? A man's voice said. This is Detective Harris. We have a few questions regarding your daughter-in-law, Emily Lawson. I gripped the counter. What happened? There's been an incident, he said carefully. We'd like you to come down to the station. When I arrived, I saw Daniel first pale, shaken, sitting outside the interview room. His eyes lifted when I entered, confusion written all over his face. Mom, he said, standing up slowly. They're saying things about Emily, things that can't be true. I didn't speak. I just waited. A detective came out and introduced himself. Mrs. Lawson, we appreciate your time. We just need to verify a few details. Your daughter-in-law has been under investigation for fraudulent activities, specifically identity theft and misuse of company funds. It seems she's been operating under 2 different names. Daniel's face went white. That's impossible. The detective sighed. We have evidence, Mr. Lawson. Multiple accounts, all linked to her. We're currently looking for her. She's gone missing. The words hit like a storm. Missing. I turned to Daniel. He looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from under him. She said she had a work trip, he whispered. She said she'd be back in 2 days. The detective nodded. She never boarded the flight. In that moment, I didn't feel victory, only a deep, hollow sadness. I had wanted the truth, but not like this. We sat in silence for a long time. Daniel's hands trembled. You tried to tell me, he finally said, voice cracking. I reached out and took his hand, hesitant, unsure if he'd pull away. He didn't. I didn't want to be right, I said softly. I just wanted you safe. He nodded, eyes filled with something between shame and grief. She lied to everyone, even me. When we got home, the house he shared with her felt like a museum, neat, expensive, lifeless. He walked through it slowly, touching things like they might give him answers. Then he stopped in front of her vanity. On it was a bottle of perfumed jasmine, the same scent I'd smelled on my husband years ago when he'd come home from work late. And I'd learned what betrayal truly smelled like. Daniel picked it up, his hand shaking. I thought she loved me. She loved control, I said quietly. And she hated truth. That night, he stayed at my place. We didn't talk much. He just sat by the window, staring into the dark. There was nothing left to say that could fill the silence. Days turned into weeks. The police eventually found traces of her car abandoned near the border, documents showing she'd transferred money under a different identity. But she was gone. No arrest, no closure, just a space where her lies used to live. Daniel tried to rebuild his life, but it wasn't easy. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend cleanly. He blamed himself, then me, then no one. Slowly, time dulled the sharp edges of betrayal, but it never erased them. As for me, I learned something too. Truth doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brings destruction first, a necessary fire that clears the rot. Months later, on a quiet Sunday morning, I found a letter in my mailbox. No return address, just my name. Inside was a single line written in neat handwriting. You should have stayed silent. No signature, but the scent, faint and unmistakable, of jasmine. I burned it that evening, watching the paper curl and blacken in the flame. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel fear. I felt finality, because even if she was still out there, even if she still blamed me, she no longer had power over the truth. The seasons changed before Daniel began to really speak again. Winter had settled in, the kind that makes even walls feel cold, no matter how high you turn the heat. We lived like quiet shadows passing through the same rooms, avoiding the one word neither of us could escape. Emily. He'd gotten a new job, a modest one, nothing like what he used to have when she managed his every move. He was rebuilding small, steady steps. I didn't interfere, didn't mother him. I just made sure there was food on the table, and that the silence between us didn't swallow him whole. But there were nights, long, haunted ones, when I'd hear him from his old room. The sound of drawers opening, then closing again, like he was searching for something he'd never find. One night, I finally asked, "What are you looking for, Daniel?" He stared at me, hollow-eyed. "Answers," he said. "Why her? Why did I let her do this to me?" I wanted to say it wasn't his fault, that people like her know how to find soft hearts and squeeze until they bleed. But the truth? I knew he needed more than comfort. He needed clarity and maybe a little of the truth I had once withheld from him. So I sat across from him and said, "Do you know why I recognized her lies, Daniel?" He looked up. "Because you didn't like her from the start?" I shook my head. "Because I used to be her." That made him pause. I hadn't told him the whole story. Not about the years before he was born. Before I met his father. I'd been young once, too young, and fell for a man who promised everything and delivered nothing. He used charm like a blade, carving pieces out of me until I barely recognized myself. When I finally left, I swore I'd never fall for manipulation again. "People like her," I said softly, "they know how to read people. They can sense what you need to hear. You think they love you, but really, they just love what they can get from you." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The understanding in his eyes was enough. Weeks later, we got a call. It was the police again. They'd found something or someone. "Mrs. Lawson," the detective said, "we believe your daughter-in-law may be involved in another case under a different identity. We'd like you and your son to come in for identification." Daniel stiffened when he heard. I could tell he didn't want to go. He wanted to move on, but closure doesn't ask if you're ready. At the station, they showed us surveillance photos. A woman with shorter hair, a darker color, and sunglasses. But even through the disguise, it was her. The posture, the tilt of her head, the same perfume bottle in her hand. "Jasmine. She's been working under the name Claire Morris," the detective explained. "We believe she's using fake credentials to apply for positions in small firms, gaining access to financial data." Daniel exhaled slowly. "So she hasn't changed?" "No," I said, voice calm. "People like that rarely do." After we left the station, we sat in the car for a long while. Neither of us spoke. The city moved outside, ordinary and uncaring. Finally, Daniel said, "What do I do if she comes back?" "You don't," I replied. "You let her knock on an empty door." That night, I found him burning old photos, the wedding pictures she'd forced him to take, the anniversary cards that now read like jokes. Watching him feed the fire felt like witnessing a quiet exorcism. He didn't cry. He didn't even flinch. He just watched the smoke rise. His face blank, then said, almost to himself, "I'm done letting ghosts live rent-free." I wanted to believe that. But ghosts, especially the living ones, don't always stay buried. A few days later, I came home to find a note slipped under my door. No words, just a photo me, outside the grocery store that morning. And behind me, blurred but visible, was a car. A familiar one. I didn't tell Daniel. Not at first. He was just starting to feel steady again. But that night, as I sat by the window, I caught a glimpse of headlights lingering outside the house longer than usual before driving off. It wasn't paranoia. It was her. The next day, I went to the police. They couldn't do much, no direct threat, they said, but they promised to increase patrols in the area. I thanked them, though I knew it wouldn't matter. Emily was too smart for laws, too careful for evidence. That night, Daniel noticed I'd double-locked the doors. "You think she's back?" he asked quietly. I met his eyes. "I know she is." He didn't argue. He just nodded, then said something I didn't expect. "Then let's finish what she started." It wasn't revenge he meant. It was closure. Over the next week, Daniel gathered everything, all the emails, messages, and financial records she'd left behind. We sent them to the police, to her old employers, even to one of the companies she was currently targeting under her new name. It was strange, working together like that. There was a calmness to it, like cleaning a wound. Painful, but necessary. A month later, we got a call from the same detective. "Mrs. Lawson, Mr. Lawson, I thought you'd want to know. She's been arrested." Daniel went still. I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. "Where?" "Out of state. She was caught trying to open another fraudulent account. She's facing serious charges." I should have felt relief. I didn't. I felt tired, like I'd been holding my breath for too long. Daniel put his hand over mine. "You were right, Mom." I looked at him. tears blurring the edges of everything. I wish I wasn't. He managed a small, broken smile. Me too. The trial took months. We didn't attend. We didn't need to. The truth had already done what justice couldn't. It broke her illusion of power. When it was over, the world didn't change dramatically. The sun still rose, bills still came, and life moved on. But something inside Daniel shifted. He began to laugh again, real laughter, not the hollow sound I'd grown used to. He moved out that summer, bought a small apartment, started painting again, something he'd given up when he met her, and one morning, he showed up at my door with coffee and a sketchbook. On the first page, he'd drawn two figures, a woman standing under a storm, another holding an umbrella beside her. "I thought this was us," he said. "You stood there with me even when I didn't want you to." I smiled. "That's what mothers do." He hugged me, the kind that feels like an apology and a promise all at once. As for me, I stopped waiting for closure that never quite comes. Some people spend their whole lives chasing justice, but sometimes justice isn't a verdict. It's peace. Still, on quiet nights, when the house creaks and the air smells faintly of jasmine from a neighbor's garden, I catch myself looking toward the window, not out of fear, but out of memory, because ghosts don't scare me anymore. They remind me of who I had to become to survive them. After Emily's arrest, I thought the story was over. I thought peace would feel louder, like a door slamming shut. But peace is quiet. Almost too quiet. It creeps in slowly, like dust on forgotten furniture. It doesn't announce itself. It waits for you to notice. Daniel had found his footing again. I watched him build a new rhythm, working, painting, sometimes smiling without hesitation. But healing is never linear. Some nights he'd still freeze mid-conversation, lost in old echoes. Some mornings, I'd see the same exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that comes from dreaming of people who once meant everything. We were both learning how to live in the after. Then one afternoon, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside, a small photograph, Emily, sitting on a bench outside a halfway house. Head down, hair shorter, no makeup, her hands folded in her lap. On the back, a single word written in her handwriting. "Sorry." I stared at it for a long time. I wasn't sure what emotion it wanted to stir. Pity? Closure? Or fear? But when I turned it over again, all I felt was nothing. That, I realized, was the real ending, not hate. Not relief. Just stillness. Daniel came by that evening. I didn't plan on showing him, but he noticed the photo on the table. He picked it up, stared at it in silence, then asked quietly, "Do you believe her?" I didn't answer right away. "I believe she's sorry she got caught," I said. He nodded. "I used to think forgiveness was the key to moving on. But maybe forgetting is." There was truth in that. But forgetting wasn't as simple as erasing. It was about remembering differently. About no longer letting the past decide the temperature of your present. Over the next few months, life became softer. My garden bloomed again. The jasmine bush that had once haunted me now carried a scent I could finally tolerate. I spent mornings tending to it, hands buried in soil, feeling the ground remind me that growth always comes after burial. But the real turning point came quietly, like most things that mattered. It was spring. The air was warm, heavy with the promise of rain. Daniel called, his voice unusually bright. "Mom," he said, "I got commissioned for a mural. A big one, for a new company headquarters downtown." I smiled into the phone. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. What company?" He hesitated. "Ironically, the same firm Emily once worked with." For a moment, I froze. Life really did have a strange sense of symmetry. "Will that bother you?" I asked. He laughed softly. "No, if anything, it feels like taking something back." A week later, I went to see the mural. It was massive, an entire wall painted in shades of gray and gold. The image was abstract but haunting. Two figures standing on opposite sides of a broken mirror, both facing their reflections, not each other. "It's called recognition," Daniel said when I joined him. "It's about learning to see yourself again after someone's tried to rewrite who you are." I couldn't speak. My throat tightened. Not from sadness, but from pride, the kind that comes when you realize pain didn't destroy someone. It refined them, A few people from the company came over to compliment him. Among them was a woman older, confident, dressed sharply. "Your son's talent is remarkable," she told me. "We're lucky he agreed to work with us." Daniel smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised how many people underestimate others based on where they come from." Her smile faltered, unsure if it was a joke or a truth too sharp to comment on. Later, as we stood outside, he turned to me and said, "You know, she reminds me of Emily, not in looks, in presence." That same air of control. I nodded. "But this time, you're not the one being controlled." He smiled. "No, I'm not." That evening, as we walked back to my car, he stopped by a small cafe. "Let's celebrate," he said. For surviving, the cafe smelled of coffee and rain. I watched him from across the table, the way he moved, spoke, carried himself. There was no trace of the broken man who once slept through days and whispered apologies to ghosts. "Mom," he said suddenly, "do you ever think about Dad?" The question caught me off guard. It had been years since we spoke of him. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Why?" He shrugged. "Just wondering if he'd be proud of us, of how we turned out." I smiled gently. "He'd be proud of you. And maybe of me too." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain tapping the windows. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You know, maybe pain's just the universe's way of forcing us to evolve." And somehow, that line felt truer than anything either of us had said in years. That night, after dropping him off, I took the long way home. The city lights shimmered across puddles, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel haunted. I felt steady. When I got home, I found another letter in my mailbox. No photo this time, just words. "Thank you for not destroying me completely. You could have. I know that now." No signature, but I didn't need one. I tore it in half, dropped it into the trash, and whispered to the empty room, "You destroyed yourself." It wasn't vengeance. It was true, because by then, Emily no longer mattered. What mattered was that the story she tried to write for us had failed. She wanted us broken, dependent, bitter. Instead, we had built something stronger, quiet, resilience. And that's the thing about survival. It doesn't roar. It doesn't demand attention. It just exists quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. The turning point wasn't her downfall. It was our peace. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the sound of two people finally breathing again. Healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in fragments, a laugh that doesn't feel heavy. A morning where coffee tastes like comfort again. A night you fall asleep without checking the door twice. That's how it happened for us, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet, ordinary ones that stitched themselves into something resembling peace. Daniel had changed in ways even he didn't realize. There was a calmness in him now, a kind of steadiness that only comes after you've been broken and had to rebuild every piece by hand. He no longer walked with the guilt of someone who'd loved the wrong person. Instead, he carried the clarity of someone who'd finally learned what real love should look like. He came to visit one morning, holding a small box. "It's nothing fancy," he said, placing it in my hands. Inside was a keychain, shaped like a house. "For you, for everything you've done." I laughed softly. "I have a house, Daniel," he smiled. "Then consider it symbolic. You're the reason I still have one." It was simple, but it meant more than any apology or grand gesture ever could. As the weeks passed, I started writing again. Not letters, not reports, just memories. Pieces of my life I'd never told anyone. Not even him. About my youth, my mistakes, my lessons. I wanted to leave behind something more than just a story of what happened to us. I wanted to leave the truth of who we were before the storm. Sometimes Daniel would sit with me while I wrote, sketching quietly beside me. It became our ritual. No words, just the comfort of presence. One afternoon, I looked over his shoulder and saw what he was drawing. It was a woman, sitting at a window, light spilling over her face, older, yes, but strong. The lines were soft, loving. "Is that supposed to be me?" I asked. He grinned. "It's who I see when I think of home." Something in me broke, not from pain, but from relief. For years, I'd been the one protecting him. Now, somehow, He'd become my reminder that I'd done something right. It wasn't long after that when a letter arrived from the prison. This time, it was addressed directly to Daniel. He brought it over, hands trembling slightly, and asked if I wanted to read it with him. Inside was a single page. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I understand now what I did to you. You were kind, and I mistook that for weakness. I don't know who I am anymore, but I hope you find happiness away from me. There was no manipulation in those words. No perfume. No charm. Just broken honesty. Daniel folded the letter slowly, then said, "She finally sees it." I looked at him. "Does it change anything?" He shook his head. "No, but it changes me." He burned the letter that night. Quietly. No anger. Just finality. And after that, it felt like something lifted from our lives. The last shadow of her influence finally gone. By summer, the mural project had expanded. Daniel was being offered contracts in other cities. He asked if I'd be alright if he moved for a while. Of course, I told him, "You don't owe me your presence, just your peace." He smiled, eyes soft. "You always say the right thing." The day he left, I stood at the station watching him go, remembering all the nights I'd sat awake waiting for him to come home when things were bad. Now, he was walking towards something better, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid. That evening, I came home to an empty house that didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. I walked through each room slowly, letting the silence settle, and realized that silence can be a kind of music when it isn't filled with fear. I sat by the window, the same one I'd once watched through, expecting headlights that never came. Outside, the jasmine bush was blooming again. Its scent floated through the room, gentle this time, no longer heavy with memory. I thought about how far we'd come from suspicion to heartbreak to this calm, quiet strength. There was a time I'd wished for revenge, for her to feel what we felt. But now, I didn't want her pain. I just wanted her absence. And I finally had it. Sometimes strength isn't about standing taller than those who broke you. It's about standing still and realizing you don't need to prove you survived. Before going to bed that night, I opened my notebook and wrote one last line beneath all the pages I'd filled. "Healing isn't forgetting, it's remembering without bleeding." And as the clock ticked softly in the quiet of that house, I knew that was the ending I'd been waiting for. Not her downfall, not justice, but peace. Time moved quietly after Daniel left. The house no longer echoed with the sound of fear or grief, only the soft rhythm of life rebuilding itself. It was strange, really, how peace felt at first like emptiness. After years of surviving chaos, silence almost frightened me. But soon, I learned it wasn't emptiness, it was space. Space for new mornings, new breaths, new purpose. I started volunteering at the community center. At first, I only went to help with small things, folding pamphlets, pouring tea, sweeping up after events. But then one day, a young woman came in. She looked exhausted, bruised in ways that weren't visible. She sat across from me and whispered, "I don't know where to go." Her words hit me like a mirror, shattering. I saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear I once wore when I realized the person you trust most could destroy you from the inside out. I didn't have a speech ready, no grand advice. I simply reached across the table, took her hand, and said, "You're already on your way. You're here." From that moment, I knew why life had led me through so much pain, not to destroy me, but to teach me how to guide others out of their own darkness. The center became my second home. I began organizing small workshops, helping women rebuild their confidence, showing them how to handle finances, how to stand on their own 2 feet. I wasn't a savior. I was just someone who understood what survival costs and what freedom feels like once you earn it. Every time one of them smiled again, it felt like a small repayment for all the nights I'd cried myself to sleep. Months later, I received a postcard. The front showed a mural, bright, sprawling, full of color and light. It was Daniel's work. I could tell instantly. But when I turned it over, I froze. "For everything you did that I didn't thank you for, this is your wall too. Love, Daniel." It was painted on the side of a women's shelter in another city. A mural of rising figures, mothers, daughters, sisters, all painted in shades of dawn. I pressed the card to my chest and laughed through the tears. He hadn't just found peace. He'd turned his healing into something bigger, something that lived on walls and hearts alike. That night, I lit a candle near the window. The jasmine outside had grown tall, filling the air with its scent again, a scent that once made me sick with suspicion. Now it smelled like survival, like reclaiming what was mine. I sat there for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. The lies, the betrayal, the fear, and how all of it had shaped me into someone unbreakable. There was a time I thought justice meant punishment. That to heal, someone had to pay. But now I understand real justice is peace. Real strength is forgiveness. Not for them, but for yourself. When people looked at me now, they didn't see a victim. They saw a woman who'd walked through fire and came out carrying the light. One afternoon, I was sitting in the garden when my neighbor stopped by. "You've done wonders with this place," she said, admiring the flowers. "You must have someone helping you." I smiled. "No," I said softly, "just me." But I had help learning how to live again. It felt good to say that out loud, to acknowledge the journey, not just the survival. Sometimes I still think about her, the woman who tried to take everything from us. I don't hate her anymore. Hatred would mean she still has power over me. What I feel now is distance. She's just a chapter, and I've already turned the page. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the golden light spread across the walls. The same walls that once held my fear now reflected warmth. The past didn't vanish, but it finally stayed where it belonged, behind me. Before going inside, I looked once more at the jasmine bush swaying in the breeze. Its petals had begun to fall, scattering across the porch, soft and white. For years, that scent meant betrayal. Now, it was just a flower, ordinary, harmless, and free. And so was I later that night. I wrote the final entry in my journal, the same one where I had once documented my pain. We don't heal when they apologize. We heal when we stop waiting for them to. I closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf, and finally allowed myself to rest. Life after betrayal isn't a fairy tale. There are no grand celebrations or perfect endings, but there is peace. And peace, I've learned, is enough. The woman who once whispered through tears, "How could they do this to me?" is gone. The woman who sits here now has different words, quieter, but stronger. They did what they did. I became who I am, and that is the difference between surviving and living.